tō katoa, no mai, haere mai, ki tēnei hui. I'm Helen Hedges, and I welcome you on behalf of the Early Childhood team at the Faculty of Education and Social Work at the University of Auckland. We welcome you to a very timely seminar on teacher wellbeing. This is our third fully online webinar, thanks to the Delta variant of COVID-19. While we miss the networking and socialising of in-person events, we're delighted to be increasing our reach across Aotearoa, New Zealand and the globe. We welcome you all to the faculty's whānau. With regard to the webinar format, Justine and I wish to thank Grace Jones from the faculty's marketing and communications for setting these up, and Hayley Chan, our wonderful early childhood PhD student with lots of knowledge and confidence in IT skills, who manages these on the day for us. A reminder then, please, to use the chat functions on our Zoom platform to send us any messages, and the Q&A for question and answers format. Use that button to send questions you would like me to ask the presenters after we have heard from them both. A reminder too that all our former presentations are available on our YouTube channel, and you may like to check some of those out later. With that, for now, I will hand you over to Maria Cooper, who's here today to introduce our presenters. Maria.
Thank you, Helen. Kia ora koutou, talofa lava. Thank you for the honour of introducing our speakers for today's seminar. Natalie Hopper is a professional supervisor and teaching mentor with the University of Auckland, and I was very privileged to play a supporting role in her master's research on early childhood teacher leaders' experiences of emotional labour, an interest which stemmed from her own experiences as a centre leader and professional learning facilitator. Natalie is now expanding on her interest in teacher wellbeing and the emotional qualities of early childhood teaching through additional postgrad study in psychotherapy and counselling. Good on you, Natalie. Dr. Justine O'Hara-Gregan, one of our most recent doctoral successes here at the Faculty of Education and Social Work, is a professional teaching fellow. She brings extensive experience to her current role, having been an early childhood and primary teacher, an early intervention teacher, a play centre parent educator, and now a teacher educator. Justine's interests are based around the notion of relationships with and between people, places, and things. Nau mai, haere mai, Natalie and Justine.
Thank you, Maria. Kia ora koutou. That slide took a long time to transition. Sorry about the pause. Thank you for having me. It's great to be able to speak to you all today about emotional labour. I thought we could start with a bit of a definition just to get clear on what we are talking about. So, what is it? Emotional labour is the act of suppressing or generating emotions in order to support a positive response from someone else in the workplace. There are two ways that you can go about this. So we have surface acting, and that's where you might feel one thing on the inside, but on the outside display something else. So the underlying feeling hasn't shifted, but what you are expressing has. And the other form is deep acting. And so that's when someone feels one way and they try and shift that underlying feeling in order to match the required display. So if I try and think of some examples for you in an ECE context, let's say surface acting might happen at the end of the day, and it's been a busy day, a hard day, lots been happening, and a parent is collecting a child. Let's pretend it's normal non-COVID times, and they come up to you and say they're quite stressed and frustrated because a sock is missing, you know, their child's sock is missing. And in your head, you're thinking, goodness gracious, it's just a sock. I really don't have the capacity for this right now. But rather than showing that kind of frustration or query, I guess. You instead present a professional, supportive, empathetic kind of demeanor and say, you know, that's really frustrating. Sorry about that. We're going to do a really great scan for the sock when we're cleaning up. Deep acting on the other. So with that, the person hasn't shifted how they feel, but they've shifted their kind of facade. With the deep acting, however, you're trying to shift what you really feel in order to match what you feel is needed. I think the best example of this that comes to mind for me is around settling infants and toddlers. So let's say you've got quite a few new infants that have started, a few that are taking a bit to settle into the new rhythm of things. And by the end of the week, you might be finding yourself feeling a little more stressed or heightened or angsty. But you know that in order to settle that child, you need to first kind of generate a sense of inner calm yourself. You could fake it, but that's not really going to help that child to feel reassured and settled. So I'm wanting to share just some of the key findings from my master's research, which was carried out in a range of early childhood centres in Auckland with teacher leaders. First, I thought I'd say, why did I kind of embark on this? As Maria suggested, I previously worked in a professional facilitating and teacher mentor role, and I was finding in that role just coming across a lot of stressed leaders in particular, really kind of a lot of burnout, and this phenomenon, I guess, of I'd go into their office to do some mentoring, and within moments of closing the door, the teachers were in tears. And I guess I wanted to kind of try and figure out what might be going on there. And emotional labour kind of became the key concept for unpacking that. So what did I find? Top line, big picture. I don't imagine you're very surprised. Emotional labour is in fact present in early childhood teaching and leadership. I think it is important, and I think it's important to say that it's important, and it's not a solely kind of negative thing. It's quite complex and multifaceted. It's often implicit and taken for granted, and this is something that I want to kind of hone in on today, and in the sense that when it remains implicit and taken for granted, that is when it can be particularly problematic. In terms of this taken for granted, that element sort of really kind of sunk in for me. I had this realization when I was working in a centre and I needed to use their bathroom, and plastered along one of the bathroom walls was a whole heap of inspirational quotes. And as I kind of like took this site in, it just struck me how potentially problematic, or the implicit kind of thinking we have around teaching. So, I mean, we've got something like keep calm and think positive, which is, you know, seems rather kind of inoffensive, but the assumption is that the person going into that bathroom is in fact stressed and is not feeling very positive and needs to turn that around in order to get back out there in the classroom. But the one I found probably more problematic is that a good teacher is like a candle. It consumes itself to light the way for others. And I just hope that's not true. You know, I hope we don't have to burn ourselves right to the ground in order to be good teachers. So I've got 3 key themes from the research that I want to share with you today. I want to start with this idea of it being motivated by care. And yeah, it's just kind of a key thing that sets emotional labour in early childhood apart from it in other contexts. So Ali Hochschild was the sociologist that kind of coined this phrase, emotional labour, did a lot of early research around it, particularly within the service industry and with flight attendants. Her research typically kind of painted this picture of employees performing emotional labour in order to kind of toe the company line and fulfill some sort of organisational mandate. However, the leaders in my study appeared to be driven mostly by care for and of others. So care of children, colleagues, and parents of whānau in the centre. So it wasn't about doing what my boss says, but being motivated by this ethic of care. I've got just throughout some snippets of interviews from the participants, because I think I could explain these ideas, but they kind of do a better job of capturing the essence of it. So we have here, that's sort of your role and your responsibility, obviously, as teachers. We're there to provide a safe and nurturing environment for our children. And I think as a leader, you're there to provide a safe and nurturing environment for your team. So this one kind of captures that multi-layered level of care that you're thinking about in those teacher-leader roles. I think this one has some great insight for us, which is when it's, oh, sorry, I've got muddled here. This one's great. When it's going right, it makes me happy and makes me feel like I'm doing the right thing with my life and that I'm starting theirs in a good way. It makes me feel, I mean, it's not love, but it's a connection with the children, a really close bond. And this is kind of reiterating that sense that emotional labour doesn't always lead to an emotional toll that can be quite rewarding as well in certain contexts. The next theme that I wanted to share with you is what I've called the mask. So essentially what became quite clear in my conversations with teacher leaders was that there are these expectations of how an early childhood professional ought to be. And they were described as needing to be a positive nurturer, motivated, energetic, and open-minded and held together. However, this was often described in the context of feeling quite literally the opposite underneath. So we were masking a sense of exhaustion in favour of enthusiasm, or presenting a really confident demeanour in place of actually feeling quite overwhelmed. For example, this person's story, the biggest part of our role in the under twos is being a nurturer. So I think showing the kindness and affection to the families and the children is something that I hold as important. And I guess I wouldn't have felt comfortable leading on to any of the parents about any of the stuff that was going on. I kind of just think it's more professional to be held together and happy and confident at work. So you can kind of hear in here that this teacher was experiencing some challenges in her own life, in her work life, but what she saw as most important was this kind of professional mask of being held together and happy and confident. This one, I think, has great insight for us. I didn't realize how much I held back what I was really feeling until I started looking at this, actually, until she engaged in this research. And then it's like, yeah, my whole job is this big face, this big mask of I've got to watch everything I say and I do. Well, not got to, I suppose, but I choose to. And I really appreciate her reframing there of actually it is a choice to engage in that. The last factor that I wanted to touch on today, or theme rather, was this idea of support. So seeking support from others was a really significant factor in how leaders experienced emotional labour and how they could manage the potential toll of it. So even though it was experienced in differing ways, support was kind of typically described by the level of emotional honesty that the leader felt able to express with those around them. So could they take their mask off with others at times, or was that kind of mask and facade quite permanently on? So you can hear in this example of a teacher leader who felt quite well supported was that I'm so lucky that I'm in a supportive team. We're all comfortable with talking with each other. So even if there are days where we're feeling like, you know, we can pick each other up. So this ability to be transparent and emotionally honest with her team. The flip side being a leader who felt that that wasn't always accessible. But the flip side of that is that when I'm really stressed or upset, I never show it, unless she named another teacher knows when I need that support the most, no one will see that. And the sense that I got through this research was that those that could be emotionally honest could manage that toll or that impact a lot better than those that felt that they were kind of having to carry that load alone. So where to from here? I think it's clear that ECE leaders typically have a desire to care for others, for children, whānau, kaikoa. And you know, honestly, and perhaps it's part how we've been socialized that we find ourselves gravitating towards these roles and doing this emotion work almost on autopilot. Yet we know that stress and exhaustion and burnout are all realities in teaching, and perhaps even more so in our current climate. So what might we do about it? This could be like slightly counterintuitive, but what I am kind of posing today is that perhaps we actually turn towards it and lean in. What if we embrace this as a key component of our role and make it explicit? Because that way we can engage a little more mindfully and critically. We can decide when is it appropriate to use this skill set? How can we do that in a way that is beneficial to others as well as ourselves? And hopefully cultivate a bit of a healthier relationship in order to use this as a skill set with intention, rather than something that happens by deficit or just by accident even. So it's not a given, but a choice. And in thinking about that, I thought, actually, I need to revisit the definition that I was using in my research, because we've said the act of suppressing or generating emotions in order to support a positive response. Perhaps we could rephrase that as choosing to suppress or generate emotions in order to support a positive response from another in the workplace. It empowers us to kind of see this as a skill set rather than something that's just expected of us. So I just wanted to offer one practical kind of place that we might be able to begin, and I'm hoping Justine can add all sorts on top of this, really. But what I found was, with all of the participants, I asked them to complete a journal before we did the interviews for the week leading up to it. And that was just a data gathering exercise for me. But the kind of positive byproduct of that was that they all found it really helpful. And I think the thing is that in order to move from something being implicit or taken for granted, we need to have some sort of tools to bring our awareness to this. And so these were the questions that I had them answer. So an emotional response of mine I felt I needed to hold back or suppress today was, fill in the blank. Instead, I chose to express, and doing this made me feel. So it's just kind of a couple of steps to be able to identify those moments, those times where you might have actually been kind of suppressing what was really going on for you and choosing to express something else. So maybe an emotional response I needed to hold back today was frustration and anger. Instead, I chose to express calm and fun or humor. Doing this made me feel. Did it make me feel more calm and in a good place, or did it make me feel actually more angry and resentful? Then the last one is the events leading up to this or contributing to this were. I think that was very helpful for me, as in outsider trying to understand what was going on. But the key ones that were quite helpful for the participants were really those top three, where it allowed them to kind of move a little closer to expand their awareness of this phenomenon that's happening in our teaching. So that's a bit of a broad overview of emotional labour in ECE. And as I said, I think that Justine's focus on mindfulness will offer plenty of ways to kind of enhance that even further. Over to you, Justine.
Kia ora, Natalie. Yes, there's lots of lovely synergies between our work. Okay.
Kia ora tātou. Just a reminder to pop your questions in the Q&A for both presenters, please, just while Justine's getting her PowerPoint up. Thank you.
So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ko mauau te maunga, ko tauranga te moana, ko kaituna te awa, he tangata tiriti ahau. Ko Justine O'Hara-Gregan taku ingoa. I'm delighted to be with you for the seminar session and to be presenting alongside Natalie. Natalie and I have a shared interest in the wellbeing of early childhood teachers and leaders and have been weaving this into our work for several years now. And it has also obviously been the focus of our research studies. And in this presentation, I'm going to share with you some key points from my recently completed doctoral research, which explored early childhood teachers' lived experiences of practicing mindful self-compassion. My slides to move. So as Natalie outlined in her presentation, teaching and leading in the early childhood sector is emotional labour, and it has direct implications for the wellbeing of those who work in the sector. Te Whāriki states that the well-being of each child is interdependent with the well-being of their kaiako parents and whānau. And this statement sits alongside a growing body of research and literature, which highlights the complex, caring and relational nature of early childhood teaching and the implications of this for early childhood teachers' holistic well-being and teachers' ability to effectively care for and educate young children. So care is central to our work as early childhood teachers and leaders, and ethics of care inform our pedagogy and practice. Unfortunately, it seems that our understandings and interpretations of care are often missing a vital ingredient, a recognition that the carer, or the one caring, is also worthy of and entitled to care. Bernice Fisher and Joan Tronto have defined care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And that definition makes clear that care is not only outwardly or other-focused, but also includes our bodies and ourselves and is a complex, interconnected practice. Nell Noddings, another care ethicist, further identified that the ethical responsibility to care is as much directed towards the one caring as to the cared for. If the one caring is not supported and cared for, then they lose the ability to care. The challenge for early childhood teachers is to maintain their own well-being while caring for others, because, as Robin Levitt has noted, total selflessness on the part of the caregiver may actually impede her ability to care as she loses herself in the process. These ethical conceptualizations of care connect well with ideas around compassion. In English, compassion has been defined as the feelings of sympathy or pity we have for the suffering and misfortune of others, combined with the desire to help alleviate their suffering. This notion of compassion as being other-focused contrasts with notions of compassion in the Buddhist tradition, where giving compassion to others, but not to ourselves, is seen as drawing an artificial distinction between ourselves and others, and fails to recognize our essential interconnectedness. Thupten Jinpa, who's a scholar and former translator for the Dalai Lama, has argued that compassion for others can exist and be practiced without self-compassion, but if we neglect our own needs, it can lead to emotional burnout over time and leave us depleted and exhausted. And other compassion researchers such as Paul Gilbert and his colleagues have stated that in terms of the flow and direction of compassion, we can have compassionate feelings for others, experience compassion from others, and we can have empathy and compassion for ourselves. And Brooke Lavelle further simplified this by saying that compassion develops through the three interconnected processes of receiving care, extending care, and engaging in deep self-care. So compassionately caring for carers and the importance of this has not traditionally been highlighted in the research literature, in initial teacher education programs, or in ongoing professional learning and development. So the motivation for my doctoral research study was to offer early childhood teachers a way of compassionately caring for their own well-being so they could continue in that work of caring for others. In reviewing the literature around well-being and strategies for supporting well-being, I came across psychologist Neff's work on mindful self-compassion practice, which has been found to contribute positively to holistic well-being, and this inspired my research question. What are early childhood teachers' lived experiences of the practice of mindful self-compassion, and how might being mindfully self-compassionate contribute to teacher well-being and teaching practice? And arising from that question were three subsidiary questions. What is it like to be an early childhood teacher? What is it like to respond to teaching challenges with mindful self-compassion? And finally, what is it like to be a mindfully self-compassionate early childhood teacher? And in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to give a brief outline of the methodology and design of my research study and the key findings in response to the second of the three subsidiary questions. What is it like to respond to teaching challenges with mindful self-compassion? So my research methodology was an adaptation of Benson Shapiro's methodology of mindful inquiry and combined mindful compassion, hermeneutic phenomenology, and care. In essence, what this means is that an ethic of care and a mindfully compassionate approach was central to the way I explored the lived experiences of the teachers who participated in my study. The spiral research design recognised the non-linear nature of the research process. Each phase of the research process was a turn in the spiral of mindful inquiry, beginning with recruitment of 12 qualified early childhood teachers as participants. The 12 teachers came from 6 different early childhood settings. 5 were provisionally certificated and 7 were fully certificated. And they were a varied group in terms of their characteristics and experiences. Initial data on the lived experience of early childhood teaching and teacher wellbeing was gathered through a focus group, and participants then engaged in an 8-week mindful self-compassion course. Following this course, teachers participated in semi-structured individual interviews where they shared their lived experiences of being an early childhood teacher and practicing mindful self-compassion. 2 months after this was a second focus group where teachers were able to share their experiences of mindful self-compassion practice with each other. Before and after each data gathering turn of the spiral, I, as the researcher, engaged in mindfully compassionate contemplation, and following these periods of reflection, I used hermeneutic phenomenological data analysis and interpretation, which included crafting texts and creating found data poems, to uncover thematic aspects of the lived experience of mindful self-compassion practice in early childhood teaching. As a qualitative study, the trustworthiness of this research ultimately comes through making the research processes visible and in the resonance my interpretations of the research data have for the participants and others who engage with this research. I initially tested the trustworthiness of the study with the research participants when I shared with them poems I had written from the focus group data. The participants' responses indicated that the poems were meaningful expressions of their lived experiences, and validated that in my crafting of the research data, I'd captured something of significance to them. So this poem is one of the first I shared with the participants and came from their responses during the first focus group to the question, what do you hope you might get out of the Mindful Self-Compassion course? But it also speaks to how they were feeling about their teaching roles at that time. So this poem is called, When is Enough Enough? I want strategies so I can be a perfect professional teacher, a mindful and present role model to the children, despite the realities of relational life. I'm a self-reflective practitioner, engaged in constant reflection, thinking and learning, sometimes exhausted by persistent rumination and tapes running in my head. I'm a self-critical practitioner, not always kind or gentle with myself, and my striving to live up to and exceed expectations. Feeling the pinch of guilt when I take time for myself. I want to know, where is the line between work and home, personal and professional? When is enough enough? After the first focus group, the teachers participated in an eight-week mindful self-compassion course. During the course, the teachers learned about the 3 key elements of mindful self-compassion practice proposed by Kristen Neff, and a range of practices to support them in enacting these elements in their daily lives. Neff's model of mindful self-compassion is based on the belief that sometimes we need to comfort and soothe ourselves, the experiencer, before we can relate to our experience in a more mindful way. Together, mindfulness and self-compassion constitute a warm-hearted, accepting presence during difficult moments in our lives. Neff's model has 3 key components which are conceptually distinct but interconnected, enhancing and supporting each other. So firstly, mindfulness, which is holding our painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness rather than over-identifying with them. Secondly, common humanity or connectedness, seeing our experiences as part of the larger human experience rather than seeing them as separating and isolating. And finally, self-kindness, extending kindness and understanding to ourselves rather than harsh judgment and self-criticism. Neff also notes that self-compassion has 2 dimensions: tender or yin self-compassion, which is soothing, comforting and nurturing, and fierce or yang self-compassion, which harnesses the energy of action to help us protect and motivate ourselves. When these 2 are fully integrated, they come together as caring force and support us to have unconditional self-acceptance and to let go of patterns of behaviour that aren't serving us so we can take action to make things better. The teachers' stories of what it is like to respond to teaching challenges with mindful self-compassion followed a common pattern. After they'd recognised that a moment of complexity and challenge was occurring, being mindful allowed the teachers to stay open to and acknowledge what arose for them, physically, mentally, and emotionally, even when it was uncomfortable, rather than ignoring or pushing aside their thoughts and feelings. So in terms of physical feelings, Rachel said, it's an exterior physical feeling, like prickles on the outside of my head. It's like I've got a hat with prickles on my head. I also get a tight feeling in my chest. And Ramona said, I was just so tight, like everywhere I was tight. I was feeling tight all around my neck and my jaw. And Louise shared the thoughts and feelings that arose for her when trying to settle toddlers to sleep. And she said, I was just wanting to go, oh my God, stop. But obviously it's not appropriate to do that. And she laughed. I was thinking, oh my God, I want to control this, but also thinking, well, I can't control this. I can't make them sleep. So focusing on their breathing helped the teachers to calm themselves and recognize that their experience was not uncommon and they were not alone. Seeing challenging experiences as common and part of being human was a source of comfort for the teachers and helped give them a sense of connection with other early childhood teachers. It also helped to shift their self-talk from being harshly self-critical to being more positive, encouraging, and kind. The teachers offered themselves both tender or yin and fierce or yang self-kindness, which enabled them to feel cared for and to continue in the work of caring for others. An example of this came from Ruby when she said, it's like I give myself a pep talk. I say to myself, this is hard, but that's okay. Other people would find this hard too. This is a difficult situation. Those sorts of words help quite a lot. The teachers identified that after practicing mindful self-compassion, they felt calm and centered. It seems that when the teachers felt calm, they could shift their perspective, recognise the needs of others and respond to them compassionately. They could also think more clearly about the challenging situation they were experiencing, make better informed decisions, communicate more effectively with others, and persist with responding to challenging situations. I'll give you a moment to read this quote from Maria, which speaks to how responding with mindful self-compassion to a challenging situation, in this case, again, trying to settle resistant children to sleep, helped to give her clarity and shift into a more calm, centered, and compassionate state. In another example, Dulcie shared her experience of practicing compassion with equanimity. She said, "We have a child who has been settling into our centre for the past 2 months. She's Japanese, speaks little English, and gets very upset every time her mother leaves. We've tried lots of strategies to help her settle, but ultimately it is just about being with her when she is upset and building a trusting relationship. I've been supporting her, and every time she says, 'Mama,' I just say, 'Mama will be back, Mama will be back.' Feeling that empathy for her and not being able to help is a huge thing for me. I've been doing that compassionate breathing of one for her and one for me, and that has kept us both calm. We've built up this really lovely bond now, and she knows she can trust me. It's awesome." And doing the compassionate breathing of alternating one for the distressed child and one breath to help soothe and calm herself, Dulcie was able to maintain a sense of equanimity, which is being able to maintain a sense of balance and perspective in challenging circumstances, and nurture and protect her own emotional well-being while compassionately supporting a distressed child, which ultimately had positive results for both of them and their relationship. The following poem helps to summarise the teacher's experiences of what it is like to practice mindful self-compassion. And this one's called "If I Remember to Breathe." Outsiders who don't do our job are like, "Oh, you just play with kids all day." And I'm like, "You come and sit here, you do this," because it's hard being with people, large and small, responding to their unceasing requests, demands, expectations, and emotions all day. Everything piles up, and it is hard to focus on one thing, hard to see people as individuals and not just a job to be done. My body becomes hard, tension in my chest and shoulders, heat rising. I feel it, and I remember to breathe. One for you, one for me, more for me, as I soften, soothe, allow, sinking into the comfort of my own supportive touch, grounding, recognizing the only presence I can control is my own. And as I breathe, the energy shifts and a space opens up, so I can see with calm, clarity, and compassion the uniqueness of these people and this moment. Being mindfully self-compassionate was a new experience for many of the early childhood teachers in the study, and a shift in how they engaged with the complexity and challenges of early childhood teaching. Teaching early childhood teachers about and supporting them to practice mindful self-compassion as a way of directly supporting well-being in teaching. Focusing on the practice of mindful self-compassion would be a meaningful addition to initial teacher education programs and to professional development and learning opportunities for practicing teachers. Practicing mindful self-compassion is not a panacea for all the complexities and challenges that arise in early childhood teaching, but as Rachel commented, learning about and practicing mindful self-compassion has added to the techniques I have in my teaching kitting. For me, mindful self-compassion practice fits in naturally with being a self-reflective practitioner and has given me more tools to use in my teaching. I would like to end by thanking all those who contributed to and participated in my research study. In particular, I would like to thank the 12 early childhood teachers who so generously and authentically shared their stories and experiences of practicing mindful self-compassion. Tēnā rawa atu koutou. Thank you all. May we all be safe, may we all be happy, May we all be healthy. May we all live with love and kindness, peace and joy.
Kia ora kōrua. What fascinating presentations. I think what's come through for me is very much around the commitment to the profession that all teachers have, and the very reason why there's a great degree of emotional labour involved, and that practicing mindful self-compassion is one really important response to kind of managing that that some of the tensions that arise. Perhaps I thought perhaps Natalie, as a first question, you mentioned in your presentation the tension between what you described, these are my words, as an employer mandate and perhaps a more personal mandate to an ethic of care. Mm. And I just wondered if you wanted to expand on that a little bit more in terms of what you meant or what your participants were telling you about in that regard, please.
Sure. I guess I was sort of drawing a comparison with how the phrase emotional labour is used in other sectors and other contexts compared to what I saw or heard actually happens in ECE. So this emotional labour wasn't described to me as being motivated because they were being told to, you know, slap on a smile and give it your best in a really explicit way. Typically it was motivated by their genuine care for the children and their colleagues and the whānau, and their desire to, you know, see them succeed and do well in that. Yeah. And so in that sense, it probably puts a slightly larger emphasis on the deep acting that I spoke about rather than the surface acting, though there's probably equal amounts of both. So I think I've just, I'll stop now. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes. Yes. And so to follow that up, I wondered if you wanted to take the opportunity to talk about any policy recommendations that would come from your research. And that policy might be at centre level or it might be at national policy level.
Policy recommendations. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that one of the centres that was engaged in the research did have a policy around emotional wellbeing. And that was the teacher that I shared the snippet in the support thing that felt really well supported. And their policy did kind of lay out the expectations and the support that's available. And so I guess that's an immediate thing that can be kind of implemented by any leadership team, right? At a higher level, I've got to admit, I'm a little bit rusty, Helen. It's been a hot minute since I was actually writing this thesis, but I guess probably around our supporting and development of leadership. So it doesn't need to be directly kind of linked to emotional labour, but your understanding or model of leadership will really shape your ability to ask for and access support. So like, it is your model of leadership, it's me and myself and the weight of the world on my shoulders, or do you have a more kind of collective and shared understanding where all of us here have this shared responsibility to see this thing flourish and grow? So yeah, that would be my thought on a higher level.
Right, thank you. Yes, I can certainly see that. I thought you would tell us about some policy recommendations for professional learning and development to kind of bring some of your interests together and some of the things that you're studying at the moment. And I'm sure that that's what people are thinking who are listening to this too, is, you know, how can we get on board with this and how can we you know, perhaps have our employers be thinking about some of these matters. So Justine, just to turn to you and start with the same kind of question. You mentioned policy recommendations for teacher education and professional learning and development. Do you want to just expand on that for a moment? And then there's a couple of specific questions about your research to follow.
Cool. So in terms of policy recommendations, I think really what I would like to see happen, and it really does require a bit of a paradigm shift, which instead of seeing teachers as this kind of invisible conduit through which care and education happen, but actually recognizing there are people behind that and foregrounding that more and actually talking about that more in our initial teacher education programs. And I know that we're starting to do that a little bit in what we do at the Faculty of Education and Social Work, but recognizing too that wellbeing is actually a human right. So we need to position it as that employee wellbeing is not just something that employers should look at in terms of so that I can get some more work out of these people, or not have them take so many sick days, but actually say, yeah, it's your right to actually experience wellbeing. And so some employers are looking at that now, I guess, through the lens of some of the health and safety legislation, where there is a little bit more of a responsibility on employers to ensure the health and well-being of their employees, but often it is put back still on the employee to do it themselves. You know, you make sure that you look after your well-being, rather than actually being something that happens within the workplace. And certainly in my research, some of the participants talked about the things that they do to nurture their well-being were things that happened outside of work. It wasn't, they didn't actually have any tools or strategies to use in the moment to look after their own wellbeing, which is where that mindful self-compassion practice became so valuable, because it gave them something to do in the moment, not just, oh, I'll go to yoga or for a walk or watch Netflix later, or whatever it might have been that they did that they felt nurtured their wellbeing. Yeah,
there's much of what you're talking about that comes from that ubiquitous mantra about work-life balance, isn't there? Which, as you say, very often puts that responsibility on the employee. Yeah, thank you. A couple of specific questions, one from Julie Plows, who's interested to know whether you used pseudonyms and how you decided on whether or not to use them.
So in my research, yes, those are all pseudonyms, and those were all chosen by the individual teachers. They chose their own pseudonyms, and partly that was because they were sharing so much and so deeply of themselves that I wanted to give them the opportunity and to kind of feel safe to share so deeply without feeling like they were exposing themselves. And also to some of what they talked about, not what I shared in this evening's presentation, but some of what they talked about too was pretty deep stuff, and they wouldn't have necessarily wanted to expose colleagues or their employers in that sharing.
Yes, those are good points. I'm sure that answers the question. And then one from Jan Gaffney, what led you to create poems to reflect back the teachers' ideas and feelings to them, and how did they respond the first time you gave them back their words in a poem?
So what inspired me was because I was using hermeneutic phenomenology as part of my research methodology. So that is very much about working with text and crafting texts. I came across Valerie Janicek's work, and she talked about using found data poems, and I was like, this is a way of me crafting. Because there was these very strong and powerful lines that kind of kept coming out, and one of the layers of the data analysis I did was looking at sort of summarizing sentences, and so I pulled a whole lot of those out and then constructed them together as the poems. And when I went back in the second focus group and shared the poems from the first focus group with the participants, there was this, oh my gosh, like that, yes, that's it, yes, that's totally it, that's how we feel. And there was again that feeling of, I'm not the only one that feels this way, that it really resonated with them. So it was incredibly powerful.
Thank you. Yeah. And a question that will for both of you, so maybe Justine, since you're still talking, we'll start with you and then come to you, Natalie. There's a question about what connections might you make between these ideas about well-being, and more specifically about resilience and self-management as some of the current terms that we are encouraged to think about in relation to children and their well-being as well. So connections between your research and the idea of resilience.
Well, I think one of the biggest connections between what my research and also all the literature that I was reading around it was around teachers' social and emotional competence, because you can't really foster the social and emotional competence of children if you don't have it yourself. And that idea too, that in particularly with looking at mindful self-compassion, was that the self-compassion, giving yourself compassion, actually is what supports you to maintain that resilience and give yourself what you need in that moment so that you can continue onwards. Yeah.
Thank you. And Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I'd definitely echo the idea that how can we possibly teach emotional competence if we are entirely out of touch with our own emotions and what we're feeling in that moment. And in terms of looking at from my research, I guess the most explicit kind of link was around the findings of support and the importance of that, the ability to be emotionally honest with someone else, whether that's someone in your team, whether it's a professional outside of your work context. But there is this sense of I think it is kind of self-compassion in a way, right? To acknowledge what you're feeling and that it's worthy of kind of being heard and held by someone else. I think resilience can be kind of co-opted into this thought of like, take a concrete pill and just sort of soldier on. But it's really not. It's kind of more that bounce back ability kind of thing. And so you're still going to have highs and lows and hard, challenging things and easy things. But do you have the kind of stretch and flex to be able to kind of be okay at the end of that? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in your presentation too, and you've just repeated it now, there's so much that's actually about the team and being able to be honest and transparent and open about your feelings and to call on support from one another in that time too. So there's also a question, I can't quite remember where I saw it, but it's obviously a bit of an ad. Any ideas about how to get an employer to offer mindfulness PD for teachers, or where to go, perhaps it might have been for that source? Any thoughts that the two of you have?
Well, I think when I was a centre manager, I would have just been like, come and ask, you know, if that's something that you've found interesting, you've read an article, you watched a webinar, just say, hey, I think this is a really important thing. Let's give it a go. This webinar will be recorded, you know, and available on YouTube. And a really easy start is watch it again with your team, you know, and then have a discussion around it. And, you know, I don't have a recommendation for where to go to currently for mindfulness, but perhaps Justine does.
I can certainly make some suggestions, but one thing that I would like to say before we kind of get into that is the notion to a lot of the literature talks now, because mindfulness has become this sort of, you know, catchphrase, this thing that we should all be doing. And some of the literature that is critiquing the sort of mindfulness craze is kind of termed as, refers to it as McMindfulness, you know, that fast, superficial thing that you can do, like, you know, just sit and breathe for 3 minutes and you'll be fine and your life will all be perfect. And that is not actually how it works. And that's why I wanted to actually get a bit deeper, because what we're seeing in some of the mindfulness programs that are offered at that more superficial level is that they take away the notion of compassion and care. And those are such central parts of being mindful. So it's actually mindfulness is about acknowledging what is arising for you in this moment. But the compassion is then, what am I going to do to alleviate and respond to it? And the other thing too, and I just kind of wanted to add in this bit, that a lot of people freak out about the word self, think, oh, self equals selfish. But actually, by practicing mindful self-compassion and being kind to ourselves, it actually gives that greater capacity to connect with others. And we also co-regulate with others as adults, so when we share how we're feeling, because we've actually been mindful and aware of it and can share with others, that then allows us to share, get from them what we need to help us regulate ourselves too. But in terms of where to go, there's so many places that you can start, but I'd say just do a bit of research into the qualifications and the background of the person that's offering the mindfulness course, because watching this webinar does not qualify you to become a teacher of mindfulness, but it's amazing how many people think that does.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. There's probably an enormously broad resource base out there, but it's checking qualifications and checking the research evidence. And that's a really good response. Thank you. Now, Maria, I am going to throw over to you now, because you had posed a question in the Q&A, I think, that I have lost. So would you like to ask your own question and then close the seminar for us, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation, so critical to today's, situation and of, the past and moving forward. My question relates to leadership and seeing things happen in relation to unproductive emotional labour and poor wellbeing in our settings. What are your thoughts on what leaders and perhaps a team what strategies they could use to identify and begin to address some of these issues around unproductive emotional labour and poor wellbeing amongst their colleagues? What are your thoughts on that?
We're both being very polite. Well, my thought, first of all, was you need to create a space where it's actually safe for people to talk about this stuff. Yeah. And in a lot of workplaces, it's not, because there is that mentality, as Natalie mentioned before, of, take a concrete pill, harden up and soldier on. And so for some teachers, it's simply, and it certainly came out in my research with the participants, for some of them, it simply wasn't safe in their workplaces to share how they were feeling. So a lot of it, I guess, where the beginning is, as a leader, how do you create a culture where people are actually willing and it is safe for them to share with you how they're feeling in terms of their well-being, because if you don't actually start to find out, you can't make any plans for moving forward.
Yeah, I'd second that, in terms of, that was the first thing that came to mind to me, is it needs to be a safe space for that. I think as well as we spoke earlier about how can a teacher support children's emotional competence if they're not yet doing that work themselves. I think you could say the same for how can a team of teachers be doing that work if leaders aren't self-aware of that kind of emotional world for themselves as well. And I think that will go a long way to creating that space of safety, self-awareness, and what are your blind spots is sort of the first step of emotional intelligence, essentially. Doing a journal exercise, like I suggested, is a really, kind of seems tiny, but a potentially helpful start. I guess also some of this stuff is hard and we all have baggage, and I kind of just want to put a plug in that seeing a therapist or a counsellor of some kind is, a really great strategy if that's what's needed, and you don't need to feel like you're at the bottom of the cliff to kind of access that. Yeah.
And I guess one thing I just wanted to add on at the end was that what my research also brought to light was that emotional labour doesn't actually have to be alienating. It can actually be really empowering. We can get a lot of joy out of the work that we do as teachers, and so that was one of the threads that came through really strongly in the section of my research where I was looking at what is it like to be an early childhood teacher, and the teachers talked about it, said it's complex, it's challenging, and it's joyful. And it was those moments of joy that would keep them in the job, and it was the joy of connecting with children and with families, seeing those moments of children making progress, achieving something they couldn't do before, and those moments when you feel like, I got it as a teacher, I nailed it, I picked up on something they were into or something I did really worked. So those things were actually what supported the teachers to continue in that emotional labour as well. So they didn't necessarily always see emotional labour as something that was this terrible weight on them, that it was actually something that could be agentic as well and really uplifting.
Yeah. And I think we really need to keep that in mind, don't we? That it's not all negative. That and that point about we choose to put ourselves in certain positions because of the care that we have for others. All right then, well, thank you so much. Ngā mihi nui kia korua. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen and hear these insights that both of you have gained from your research projects. I see there are a couple more questions, but we've come to the end of the seminar now, and I do encourage you to keep talking about this topic within your own teams. And I think asking one another how we can support each other is a really good idea as well. I think Natalie and Justine, you've really provided some critical aspects for us to think about in relation to our own practice, wherever we practice, in terms of self-care, self-compassion, but also the care and compassion we ought to have for one another and looking out for one another too. So thank you so much for sharing today, and I'm sure that our attendees have some good takeaway points to think about as well. A note for our attendees, our next and final early childhood seminar for the year will be online again, Monday, November 22nd. Louise Gorst and I will present on the topic of educational leadership in ECE, and we're going to explore some of the implicit aspects that inform the practice of leadership. So we look forward to engaging with you then and continuing the success of our early childhood seminar series. For now, thank you for your questions and for joining us online. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.